So it is about 4:28. We have 2 minutes until the next presentation, but I did want to just open up with some opening remarks. And I had actually spoken with Timothy and Lynn briefly about how I just feel as though we as a conference have really been starved for this content. So I'm extremely excited for this session and grateful that we're able to offer it. Um, but I did want to just take a second without bleeding too much into the presentation time to thank the members of my team. Morgan, Broma, Philip, and Joel have been instrumental in getting this conference to happen. So big kudos to them. We don't always see them. I know they had convened some sessions, but they are, back of the house with me, sort of responding to any sort of technical issues or any of the logistical issues that can sometimes pop up during virtual conferences. So really big props to them. Grateful to all of you for being here for what I think has been a really, I know I've learned a lot throughout the past week. So just thankful to everyone for being here and being open and learning and participating in all of the really great conversation within the chat. Hopefully we'll be able to do this in person next year, very much so. Fingers crossed that we'll be able to return to in-person programming soon. I would encourage everyone to, keep the conversation going. Hopefully folks have been able to connect in sort of private chats during the week, and we'll continue those relationships. If there's ever anything that I can do, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. I'm always excited to collaborate with partners or work with folks who are also committed to this work day or night. Reach out. I'm always excited to chat with folks. With that, I'm excited to, right at 4:30, I'm excited to formally open up this session, a topic that I'm really happy that we're able to include this year, and hopefully content like this will continue to grow. Supporting asexual survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence was a stated goal of something that we wanted to be able to include this year, and hopefully we'll be able to continue doing so in years to come. So with that, I'm going to hand over the virtual microphone to Timothy and Lynn, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank y'all for sticking with us, all of our attendees, like sticking with us on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
Appreciate you so much. So hi, I'm Timothy Bussey. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Associate Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Kenyon College, which is over in Gambier, Ohio. It's about an hour and a half north of Columbus, if you're familiar with the Midwest geography. And I am also the founder and executive director of ACE and Arrow Alliance of Central Ohio, which is the state's first and only ACE and Arrow specific organization, and one of only 5 like organizations in the entirety of the Midwest. And I will let Lynn do their introduction.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lynn Alexander, and my pronouns are they or she. And I hail from Connecticut. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Connecticut with my master's in social work. And I'm continuing to stay on as a lecturer in women, gender, and sexuality studies at the University of Connecticut. I'm also the vice president of the board of directors for the Connecticut Trans Advocacy Coalition. And I'm also pleased to share with you all that I've just recently accepted a position doing holistic counseling at Middlesex Community College, which is, if you know anything about Connecticut, it's about 30 minutes south of Hartford. So very excited, very happy to be here representing Connecticut today.
Yes, we love it so much. So I'm going to let Lynn go through our learning objectives and our kind of overview of the slide deck really quick, and then I will pop back in for the next part.
All right. And I'm sure you've probably had a chance to take a look at these, but just in case you haven't had a chance to, or the holiday weekend is starting to creep up on you. Basically, today's learning objectives are that we are going to understand key definitions and terminology related to the asexual or ACE community, learn about the prevalence of sexual and/or intimate partner violence within the community, identify different trauma-informed practices that can support asexual survivors of sexual and/or intimate partner violence, and conceptualize how to be more inclusive to ACE survivors of sexual and intimate partner violence. So just to give you a little bit of an overview of how this is going to go, we are going to talk a little bit about terminology and some definitions of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and affirmative consent. And then Timothy is going to do their thing, which is talk about the data. So what are the prevalence, what's going on in the community, and then we're going to kind of ground ourselves in a conversation around trauma-informed practices to support ACE survivors. The other thing that we would like to let you know is that if you have any burning questions as we're going along, please let us know. Feel free to unmute yourself, but you can also drop that in the chat. We're going to try our best to keep an eye on the chat so that we can kind of interrupt ourselves if we need to.
Yeah, and we will do we will be saving about 10 minutes or so for questions and answers at the end. And I think probably there will be a fair number of questions. I think just because, one reason we're so excited to present this this content is because, oftentimes ACE experiences aren't as represented in these spaces. And so we're, again, just super thankful for you all for attending, and for the conference organizers for hosting us for this conversation today too. So as Lynn mentioned, I love the fact that we have just really comprehensive actually data on sexual violence in the ACE community. But before we get into that, we are going to go over some just sort of key definitions because we don't want to assume that everyone in the audience is at the same knowledge level. So really quick, we're going to go over some definitions related to asexuality, and then we'll just get into some very brief definitions, which are probably very much a refresher for folks of sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and affirmative consent, just to make sure that we all have a common understanding of some of the words that we'll be using in this presentation. But certainly over the past week, even if you are someone who is a little earlier on in your learning about this topic and these topics, you've probably gotten a lot of that already, so we won't spend too much time on that portion. So in terms of just sort of community terminology, when we're talking about the asexual or ACE community. So asexual, and this is actually a definition from GLAAD, which is an organization that works on LGBTQ+ inclusive media, actually, pop culture media, but also journalism. And a part of their work is developing essentially a resource guide for folks who are talking about LGBTQ+ experiences. And as a part of that, they have some really comprehensive, easy to understand definitions. And so that's the quoted portion that you're seeing there. But asexual, pretty basically put, is just an adjective to describe people who don't experience sexual attraction. So for instance, an asexual or ace person. So when we're talking about asexuality, the big thing that we're talking about here is we're talking about the lack of capacity to experience sexual attraction. We're not talking about just not being necessarily interested one day or another. We're not talking about basically libido. We're not talking about that. We're talking about like asexuality as an identity. So I think that's definitely an important thing to remember, is that when we're talking about ace identities, we're specifically talking about an identity. We're not talking about a choice like such as remaining celibate or abstinent. Those are very different words from one another, and also both very different words from asexual as well. But oftentimes that's a misconception that folks come into things with. But in terms of asexual, it's also this kind of like broader umbrella term, right? So asexuality is also an umbrella term, and there are other identities underneath that broader asexual or ace umbrella. And so some of those identities are things like demisexual or gray sexual. And so these identities are describing ACE experiences, but also different from that sort of blanket large definition of asexual as a broader term. And so when we're talking about these identities, demisexual is essentially describing someone who doesn't have the capacity to experience sexual attraction without a really strong emotional connection or bond to someone first. And so that can look very different for a lot of people, but essentially there has to be a really strong emotional connection or bond between that person and another individual before that demisexual person is able to have the capacity to experience sexual attraction. And certainly for demisexual folks, that can look very, very different. I myself identify as demisexual, so under that broader ACE umbrella. And for me, like that level of attraction happened like a couple times in life. But there are certainly other demi folks who might have different experiences from my own. And then gray sexual is essentially when we're talking about someone whose capacity to experience sexual attraction kind of ebbs and flows. So you can think of it kind of like a river would ebb and flow. That capacity to experience sexual attraction can ebb and flow as well. So what that basically means is that at some points, folks are able to feel that type of sexual attraction, and then others, they're not, other points in their life, they're not necessarily feeling or having the capacity to feel that. But the important thing to remember with asexuality is we're also wanting to remain cognizant of the fact that there are multiple different types of attraction. There's aesthetic attraction, there's romantic attraction, so the kind of warm, fuzzy feeling that some people get inside, sensual attraction, and sexual attraction. So when we're talking about ace identities, we're specifically talking about sexual attraction, and we don't want to confuse asexuality with something like aromanticism, for instance. That is a completely different identity, though there are plenty of asexual folks who also may identify as aromantic. And then the other thing to remember is that the asexual community might have shared challenges, but certainly just with any other marginalized group, this community is not a monolith, meaning that similar challenges don't necessarily equate to the same experiences. And then just kind of fun fact here, this is the ACE pride flag. And if you're wondering where the purple came from, I can spend a lot of time on that, but the short version is it is from the original web servers for an organization called the Asexuality Visibility Education Network, or AVEN, and their web servers in like the late 90s, early 2000s, when web design wasn't as like nice as it is now, had this kind of purplish hue to it. So when the ACE pride flag was created, purple was chosen as a nod to that virtual community space that provided resources for so many people. And then this is the demisexual pride flag, which is obviously a variation on the ACE pride flag. And we'll give you some info if you want to learn more about those pride flags later on. But in terms of our definitions, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this just because I know that y'all have had so many folks talking about this content, but I did just want to sort of nod to the fact that, you know, we do want to make sure we have a common set of definitions for some of the things that are going to pop up in the data. So this is the Department of Justice's definition of sexual assault. So certainly there are a variety of other definitions, but for the data that we are specifically mentioning, it matches up very neatly to this definition in particular, that sexual assault is any type of sexual contact or behavior that occurs without the explicit consent of the recipient. And then falling under that definition of sexual assault are activities like forced sexual intercourse, forcible sodomy, child molestation, incest, fondling, and attempted rape. And so when we're talking about sexual assault specifically in the data that we're going to be mentioning, it is comprehensive of the things that are encompassed in this specific definition from the DOJ. And again, not wanting to spend too much time on that, but we did want to also make sure we have a common understanding of intimate partner violence. And this is from the CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control, which probably most of us are very familiar with the acronym CDC at this point in the unprecedented global pandemic. But intimate partner violence is essentially a serious preventable public health problem that affects millions of people. The term describes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm caused by a current or former partner or spouse. And this type of violence can occur among heterosexual or straight or same gender couples and doesn't require sexual intimacy. So that I think is a really important aspect to remember. And certainly when we are talking about ACE folks in particular, we can have ACE folks who are straight in terms of how they experience attraction / if they do. And we can have folks who are queer or gay or bi. So again, remembering that we can also share and hold multiple identities, and those might indicate something about sexuality, but they might also just indicate something about romantic attraction or aesthetic attraction or sensual attraction. So again, we do want to remember that just because someone shares that they are ACE doesn't mean that they also might not identify with other specific labels as well. And so like to use myself as an example, again, I identify as demisexual. So under that broader ACE umbrella, but I also identify as queer. And so, just sort of an important reminder there as well. And then in terms of our definition for affirmative consent, definitions for affirmative consent also certainly vary by location, but generally what we're seeing is components that refer to sexual acts between two or more adults and that have voluntary decision-making, explicit permission and willingness, the presence of full and sound judgment and faculties, distinct, clear, and informed communication, and the fact that it's reversible. And I, in a lot of the trainings that I do around consent, really like the acronym from Planned Parenthood of FRIES, just because it is so comprehensive and easy to remember for folks. But freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. Lynn, did you have anything else that you want to add about affirmative consent before we hop into data?
Not affirmative consent, but I did want to hold space, right, for these definitions that are coming to us from, institutions that have not always been survivor supporting and who have very sort of often very binary understandings and of what constitutes sexual violence or gender-based violence. So I just want to hold space for the fact that we are trying to do something that is pretty difficult to do, which is to hold space in a trauma-informed way while still having to make use of definitions and ideas and laws around sexual violence and gender-based violence that come down to us from very flawed institutions. So I just want to hold space for that.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, and thank you for that. I just did take a peek at the chat to make sure we didn't have any questions. Someone just graduated from Oberlin. Congratulations on graduating, particularly during a very challenging time. We actually just did a session with Oberlin for Pride Month. And we did have someone that shared that they just looked up Asexual and they're already learning new stuff. And so we love to see that. So thank you so much for sharing. So I, in terms of my academic training, am trained in social science specifically. I really, really, really like data. And I particularly really like data when we're talking about the ACE community, because so many folks think that we just don't have any specific data. And there's Lynn's cat. Hi, Kitty. I will try to do my best to not go completely over on this, but I did want to kind of note that this is not all of the data that we're going to share with you. Like, this is a very specific portion of a lot of data. And so we have pulled out stuff that we think will be most of interest and most assistance to this particular audience. But please definitely remember that this is certainly not all of the data that exists. There's a lot of it. But we did want to just talk briefly about sort of some stats that we have regarding sexual violence in relation to sexuality, so particularly LGBTQ individuals, and stats related to the trans community. Just as sort of a point of comparison, essentially a point of comparison for the ACE community, just because oftentimes when I'm having conversations about sexual violence related to the ACE community, a lot of times folks are usually in one of three spaces. One space being that they absolutely have no idea, like no idea whatsoever, no sort of bearing as to what the prevalence or impact of that necessarily is. And then the other two spaces are some folks assuming, well, that must never almost happen. Like, that must be statistically rare, because if you're ACE, you're probably not in situations where maybe you're not in a situation where you're going to experience intimate partner violence. Maybe you're operating under this presumption that, well, you're not even going to have a romantic partner. So maybe someone's conflating like ACE and hetero identities, or conflating those identities with the presence or non-presence of a relationship, which is not accurate. And then sometimes I encounter folks that presume it's really bad, like it must be far worse than any other community, because folks are just completely ignoring and validating ACE identities. And we'll sort of talk about where the data actually points us in just a moment. But when we're talking about, specifically talking about sexual violence among LGBTQ folks, this is some data that we have from the CDC, courtesy of the Kaiser Family Foundation. And so what this data is basically showing us, well, it's showing us a lot of things, but what we're seeing basically for folks, and I don't want to assume that folks can see color, so these are also layered. So the top bar on each of these is for straight folks, straight women. The orange, if you see color, or the middle bar, if you don't see color, is for lesbian women. And the dark orange or bottom bar, if you don't see color, is for bisexual folks. And then on this side, similar data points, top bar being for straight men, middle bar being for gay men, and the bottom bar being for bi men. And what this data basically shows us is that when we're talking about sexual violence and the lifetime prevalence of sexual violence for women specifically, bisexual women are reporting about a 46% rate of lifetime prevalence of sexual violence in comparison to 13% for lesbian women and about 17% for straight women. Obviously, any number is too high, but there is a massive disparity specifically that bisexual women are facing. And in addition to rape, we're also seeing that disparity with sexual violence and also seeing a further disparity with intimate partner violence as well. But again, as we can see, all of these numbers are certainly too high. And when we're hopping over to the lifetime prevalence for men, we're also seeing a similar trend where we're seeing a disparity among bisexual men in comparison to their gay men and straight men counterparts. And so what we're essentially seeing here is that largely what we know, that sexual violence impacts people regardless of their sexuality. But for folks who maybe weren't able to attend some of the bi-focused sessions during the conference, we are also seeing that there is a pretty clear disparity that affects bisexual women and bisexual men as well. And I just wanted to make sure that we're drawing attention to that, particularly given the presence of prevalence of bi erasure as well. And when we're talking about sexual lifetime prevalence of sexual assault and sexual violence for members of the trans community, this is data from the National Center for Transgender Equality from their last US trans survey. I'm really interested to see what the latest edition of the US trans survey is going to show. They're currently starting to get things ready to launch that survey now. It generally happens every 5 years, but they're running it a little bit later. So we'll get some new data hopefully in a year or two. But what we're essentially seeing with the latest data that we have from the NCTE is that the trans community overall is reporting about a 47% prevalence or a 47% rate of lifetime prevalence of sexual violence. And so when we're looking at that among a variety of other identities under that broader trans umbrella, folks who identify specifically as cross-dressers, so folks who have self-selected that identity are reporting at about 19%. And then we've got data on non-binary folks. So non-binary folks overall are reporting a 55% lifetime prevalence. And for trans-binary people, they're reporting about a 44% lifetime prevalence. And so what we're seeing is even within the trans community, we're seeing some disparities emerge where non-binary folks are actually reporting higher rates of lifetime prevalence of sexual violence and sexual assault. And then when we're looking specifically at folks who are assigned male at birth versus assigned female at birth, we're seeing a disparity between trans women and trans men, where trans men are reporting at higher rates than trans women, and where non-binary folks who are assigned female at birth are reporting at higher rates than non-binary folks who are assigned male at birth. So again, we're also seeing some disparities within both trans-binary populations, but also non-binary populations as well. So probably just by virtue of having done 5 days of the conference, a lot of what we've just shared isn't necessarily new news, but hopefully it is a good starting point for us to kind of talk about where we are with ACE folks and how the ACE community compares to this data. So when we're talking about asexual folks, we are pulling our data specifically from the Asexual Census. The Asexual Census previously, or I think they've actually renamed it now the ACE Community Survey. But this data set has over 9,000 respondents from the ACE community all across the world. It is more heavily skewed towards North America, specifically the US and Canada. But we do have some pretty comprehensive data for other countries as well. But unless we specify otherwise, feel free to certainly presume that the data is speaking about ACE people across the world, not in one specific country or context. But of this data, about 65% of folks identify as asexual, about 11% identify as gray ace or gray sexual, or gray asexual, as it's sometimes also called. And about 10.5% identify as questioning. So we do have some questioning folks in there. And then under 9% identify as demisexual. So demisexual is a little bit statistically rarer population in the ACE community. And then the median age for this specific data set is 21, and the mean age or the average is 23. So when we're talking about geographic specificity for our respondents in the US, California has actually the most respondents at about 11%, and that's followed by New York, Texas, Massachusetts, and Washington. So again, states all across the country and states that have very different climates for LGBTQ+ folks. And then just about over 75% of the respondents identified as white, about 5.6 identified as multiracial, and Asian Pacific Islander folks were reported at 4.4%, and those were the two next most represented racial and ethnic categories. And so what we're seeing here is we do have, like I said, about 3/4 of our data set is folks who are white. And so that is definitely an important consideration when we're thinking intersectionally. And so that is something to certainly pay attention to. And really for that reason, there's not a lot of great breakout data for communities of color because it's not statistically significant, but the experiences are there and the experiences certainly are significant, of course. And then this is basically just some data about ACE folks who have other sexualities that they identify with. And so what we're seeing is just under 40% of respondents are saying they only identify within the ACE community. But we're seeing a pretty interesting spread of folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bi, pan, queer, also straight, and also not sure all across the board. And so this is, I think, a really important point to also emphasize that when we're talking about the ACE community, again, we're not having a monolithic experience. There are lots of different ways in which people identify with their sexuality. But when we're actually talking about sexual violence, specifically, ACE people actually report pretty similar experiences with the lifetime prevalence of sexual violence in comparison to other segments of the LGBTQ+ community. So earlier when I shared that there are sometimes folks with these three different perspectives, two of which are assuming, wow, that must be really vastly more horrible than the rest of the community and at much higher rates. And then folks who are saying, well, they must not be experiencing it much at all. The truth is actually in the middle of those two. The truth is actually in the middle. We're not seeing something that is drastically more different from the rest of the LGBTQ+ community. What we're seeing is that the reported rates of non-consensual sex or rape is really actually similar to the data that we've seen for lesbian women. So really similar in terms of that lifetime prevalence. And then the reported rates of other forms of non-consensual sexual contact is really actually quite similar to the data that we have for gay men in particular. And so what we're seeing, again, is a picture that's showing us that for the ACE community, it's largely matching up to the broader LGBTQ+ community in terms of that lifetime prevalence. And nearly a quarter of the respondents for the ACE community survey reported that they had had sex because of some form of societal pressure. And so that's, I think, a really important point to also emphasize as well. But when we're also talking about the ACE community, let's see if I can, okay. When we're talking about the ACE community, what we're also seeing is that for folks who are experiencing non-consensual sex or rape, we're seeing about 13%, and we're seeing about 4.5% or so who are saying, I'm not sure, not really sure if that was non-consensual sex or not. And then for just general non-consensual sexual contact, we're seeing a much higher rate at almost 40% and still about 5% saying, I'm not really sure. And then for folks who are reporting they've had sex due to some type of societal pressure, that's a little over 20% or 1/5 of respondents. And so what we're seeing here again is matching up pretty closely to the experiences of lesbian women and gay men. But when we're also talking about some of the demographics when we're talking about some of the demographics related to sexual violence against ACE folks, perpetrators of sexual violence against ACE people, as reported by survivors, were predominantly men. So the people who have experienced sexual violence are reporting this data, and they reported that about 85% of that was done by folks who identified specifically as men. And about 65% of respondents who had experienced sexual violence experienced it from someone who is not an intimate partner. So not an intimate partner. And then about half reported experiencing sexual violence from an intimate partner. And so what we're seeing there is a skew where we're seeing more folks reporting I've experienced sexual violence and it was not from an intimate partner. And then about half of survivors in the ACE community saying I experienced sexual violence and it was from perpetrated by an intimate partner. And then when we're talking about the median and mean ages for the first time that an ACE person experiences sexual violence, the median is 15, so that's that midpoint, and the average is about 14. And so essentially for our ACE folks who are reporting being survivors of sexual violence, this is the average is happening to them in their teens, in their early teens. And then when we're looking at the age at which someone experienced sexual violence last, what we're seeing is that average age being about 20 and that median being about 19. And so what we're basically seeing is some folks reporting obviously very early in life and some folks reporting throughout their life. I do want to note though, there are a couple considerations with this data. It is very alarming, obviously, to hear that the average age for an ACE person to first experience sexual violence is in the early teens, and the age at last reported sexual violence is in late teens, early 20s. One thing that I do think is an important note here, particularly in regards to this age at last sexual violence, this data set does skew younger. This data set does skew younger. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And I'm more than happy to speak on that more in the Q&A, but I want to make sure that we have enough time for us to also get to Lynn's portion, because I can talk your ears off about data all day. And I gladly will if given the space, but we only have a short amount of time together. And so when we're talking about sexual violence in the ACE community, and we're thinking intersectionally in terms of gender, so we're talking about gender and trans identities, what we're actually seeing are some other sort of interesting points to pull out of the data. So this is basically our folks who are identifying as asexual, demi, gray asexual, and then questioning. And then what we're basically seeing here is that for folks who are reporting, for demographics within the ACE community that are reporting the highest levels of sexual violence, we're seeing again another disparity emerging, that demisexual and gray asexual folks are actually reporting sexual violence at statistically higher rates than folks who just specifically identify as asexual. So again, what we're seeing again, sort of similarly with the LGBTQ portion of the community, we're seeing a similar disparity where some members of the community are reporting at higher rates. Same sort of thing we were seeing with trans-binary populations and for non-binary populations as well. And then when we're talking about trans folks specifically, so hopping to this portion of the graphic, when we're talking about trans folks in particular, what we're seeing essentially is for folks who identify as trans and ACE, about 55% are reporting sexual violence at some point in their life. And for cis ACE folks, about 40%. So we're also seeing that same disparity between trans and cis members of the asexual community as well, where trans folks are reporting at much higher rates that they have experienced sexual violence at some point in their life. So the big takeaway here is, again, remembering that that community is not monolithic and their experiences are certainly not, and that even when we're talking about intimate partner violence and sexual violence within the ACE community, we're still seeing disparities, similar to disparities that we're seeing in the LGBTQ plus community more broadly. And then the last portion, and then Lynn, I'm going to let you take it away with your social work tips. But when we're also talking about the ACE community, I also like to emphasize that just because someone is ACE doesn't mean that they have not had consensual sex, and doesn't mean they're not interested in consensual sex. And so the majority of respondents for the ACE community survey, about 68%, had not had a consensual sexual experience. And just over 30% had reported that, yes, I have had a consensual sexual experience in my life. And there are a variety of reasons for that, right? There are a variety of reasons, and that is potentially a whole other presentation, but I can go through some of those during the Q&A if folks are curious. But you know, there are a whole litany of different reasons that ACE folks report having had consensual sex and being interested in having consensual sex. And basically, the median and mean ages for the first time an ACE person reports consensual sex is around 19. And you know, that's an important thing, an important point to remember. And when we're looking basically at the ways in which this data plays out, the age at first consensual sex for ACE folks, again, hovering around 19, but there are also plenty of folks, again, who are experiencing their age of first consensual sex much later in life. And I do want to give a nod to there are likely a lot more people hovering in that 30 to 50 range. But again, this data set does skew younger, and there are lots of reasons for that. So that is one limitation to take into consideration, that these numbers might be a bit different if we had a more comprehensive sampling of older cases. The important thing to also remember here too is essentially that just because someone is ACE does not mean that they have experienced sexual violence, right? We already talked about that early on in the presentation, but I just want to hammer that home because we have focused really heavily on the data pertaining to ACE folks who are reporting sexual violence. But again, that is certainly not the experience of every single ACE person, just as having consensual sex is not the experience of every single ACE person. So again, just breaking down some common myths. And Lynn, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I think we are on track for our 10 minutes of Q&A.
Awesome, awesome. And thank you all for patiently watching, or maybe not watching, as my very needy cat decided to come on screen.
I know I was.
But I know most of you or all of you may already know all of this from coming to the conference or from the work that you're doing already. But I just wanted to kind of reiterate what some really important trauma-informed practices are, so that we can kind of ground ourselves and think about them in relation to the ACE community. So, you know, the idea that healing can happen for survivors of violence, of sexual violence, but other forms of violence through the experience of having a collaborative and trusting relationship with a practitioner, therapist, caseworker, whoever, making sure that you are not only culturally humble, but responsive in your interactions. And, you know, coming to a workshop like this is a great way to help folks who are not within the community kind of understand and have ownership of their own education around this, so that we are not, you know, not able to be responsive to our clients, but also so that we're not taking up time during any kind of session getting support from our clients on how we need to be helping them. Mirroring language, I think that's a really big thing, not just for the individual themselves, but for other people in their life, other people who may be in the LGBTQ plus community, not assuming that, you know, the person who has committed this, the person who is the perpetrator, uses particular pronouns or has a particular identity, even though the data backs up it doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be a particular identity every single time. I think strengths-based approaches and like really leaning into the resilience, particularly the resilience that the LGBTQ community has and has developed over, you know, our liberation movement over the past few decades. But, you know, LGBTQ people have been here since the beginning of time, right? The resilience of being an often invisibilized and criminalized community over that long time has built a lot of resilience. Just being sensitive to the concept of re-traumatization and how interactions with providers or people who are, you know, involved in supporting a survivor can re-traumatize them through asking about, you know, specifics or making assumptions, and very, very specifically being LGBTQ plus and ACE specific in your affirming environment. So making sure that it's not just, you know, an LGBTQ sticker, a rainbow flag, or a sticker that you have in your office, in your environment. There's a lot of online, a little bit of offline tension within the LGBTQ community around whether or not asexual people are actually legitimate LGBTQ people. We're not going to entertain that here. We are saying that ACE folks are absolutely part of the community, but having ACE specific things, whether it's a flag, a sticker, making sure to include it in options when you're doing surveys or intake forms or anything like that, I think is really important, because it's a nice way to flag to people in the community that their identity here is going to be safe and it's going to be affirmed. I don't know if you want to move to the next slide. Thank you. Again, some other things that I think are really important for us to reiterate. So believing, validating survivors, maintaining and respecting appropriate boundaries as a healing practice, reinforcing our survivors' narrative ownership and their right to disclose and their right to not disclose, right? So there may be a lot of people in the community, as I said, because of friction in the greater LGBTQ community, or just generally from a very broader, like, societal community that does not affirm and support ACE folks. People who are in the community may not want to disclose, so making sure that you know who and how you're allowed to disclose their identity to other practitioners or other professionals, that sort of thing. Empowerment through emphasizing choice, control, and autonomy, as well as supporting nuanced and complex understandings, right? So I think it's really important for us here to take a moment to kind of reflect on not just the stereotypes and assumptions that folks might have around, for example, ACE folks, but also around queer folks, people of color, right? I would hazard a big reason why there are lower rates of people of color who are reporting for this ACE census is because in many ways, the hypersexualization of many communities of color means that a lot of people may not even think of themselves as allowed to be asexual. There's also the fact that a very white dominant community online may make BIPOC folks, right, and may not make them feel comfortable in identifying with that community, engaging with that community. So really thinking about, what does this kind of complex understanding, what does an intersectional understanding really look like, and being attentive to all of these different moving pieces. I also think it's really important, particularly because this is a marginalized population, to consider transformative justice and to make it a really significant part of the work that you do. Not all survivors are necessarily going to be comfortable disclosing to law enforcement or, you know, to anyone where there could be some kind of backlash or punishment for perpetrators. And this may be because, you know, that there's a shared community there, any number of different things. And we have to acknowledge and accept that, you know, we live in a society that has systems of power and institutions that don't really serve survivors in many ways. I think we are all very cognizant of that in the last 24 hours after, there was I'll just say it, after Bill Cosby was released. But I think it's important for us to move away from just thinking about what justice can look like within a carceral sense. How can justice be an integrated part of our communities at every level? How can we seek to transform systems and institutions so that they can be a source of justice? And then another couple of things that I wanted to highlight is just that we need to recognize the macro impact that influences this community with unique barriers to care. And this is common for other marginalized populations, but historical or generational trauma within the community, especially within the broader LGBTQ community, community supports, right? So somebody who is going out and trying to seek support for their experience of sexual violence may find themselves stripped of their community if the person who has perpetrated that violence against them is also part of the community, which can cause ruptures. And then, collective trauma, right? I can definitely tell you as, somebody who identifies as gray A and queer, and among other things, that, when somebody in my community is harmed, I feel that harmed. It's part of the collective trauma that we share. And also to reject common assumptions around LGBTQ survivors and ACE survivors, around individuals generally. And we're going to go into that a little bit in the next slide, just to highlight some common ones. I know there's also been some really great comments in the chat, and I want to be able to come back to them. So Tim, if you could push us forward just one more slide. Thank you so much. So just a few really common ones tend to be that some kind of physical, whether it is hormonal, right, or mental condition, depression, anxiety, especially as this intersects with folks who may be taking medications that may lower libido or sexual drive. There's that often the assumption is that the asexual identity is because of that. Another really common one is that people adopt an asexual identity because only of sexual trauma or only because of childhood sexual abuse. I want to just be very clear that there are a lot of people in the community who obviously have this kind of experience. And then there's also folks who may not be part of the asexual community, who may not necessarily identify with it, but who use some of the language around it as a way of kind of processing and dealing with their trauma. There can be some correlation, but there is not a causation. There's, the assumption that because intimate partners are, somehow owed sexual contact, this invalidates the experiences of ACE people. And this kind of goes into what somebody in the chat was mentioning around corrective rape, which is something that's also common in for queer women or not straight women. And also, behavior does not equal identity. Everyone has a different kind of response to trauma. So, if it is somebody who is asexual, who begins to have consensual some kind of sexual experiences after, as a way to kind of process their trauma, or in a way is responding to trauma, or who may not be doing that and had been previously seeking out consensual sexual activity. Again, it doesn't have anything to do with the identity itself. It has to do with how somebody is processing. And then these are some really common barriers that can exist for the community. I've talked about them a little bit. But another couple of things that I want to just kind of point out is that, when you come forward and you're part of a marginalized community, right, you fear oftentimes making things worse for your community by having, engaging in some kind of stereotype. or by splitting a community against itself. Folks may also fear discrimination for other identities or practices. So there are a number of other identities, whether that is race, gender, disability, nationality, whether someone is undocumented. But there is also some practices that may be common amongst the community, such as ethical non-monogamy, which is one of them that I'm thinking of, is that there are a number of folks who are in the ACE community who may have multiple partners, or whose partners have multiple partners, where they may have an intimate relationship that does not involve sex, but their partner may have a sexual relationship with somebody else. And stereotypes around communities and relationships like this may make somebody very hesitant to come forward. So I just want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the chat, Tim. I'm thinking maybe we should go forth and take a look at the chat and then kind of open up for questions. You are muted. I don't know if you.
I did. It's officially a Zoom call now. It's officially a Zoom call. I did take a look at the chat. Lots of folks are fans of the cat. So yeah, very good. But yeah, we have our 10 minutes at the end as promised for questions and answers. But also, thank you all so much for coming and spending time with us. I know a conference, like any conference, is a lot. And a multi-day conference on sexual and intimate partner violence is certainly a lot in terms of like the emotional work that people put in. So thank you all so much for spending that additional time with us. And if folks have questions about just ACE identities in a more general sense, we would, I'm sure, be happy to cover that. I am also going to stop our screen share, and I am going to pull. I'm going to pull something else while folks are thinking of questions.
I also just want to say, like, this to me is such a beautiful community. And I think, the community of folks who are working in doing this work and really committed to this work are just so full of amazing, giving, dedicated people. And I want to thank you and just express how excited and happy I am to be here. And I think it's just so important that we give ourselves the kind of kudos and the pats on the back for doing the work that we should do, because a lot of the time we are not seen, and we don't often see the work that we see because we're kind of focused on being super people who are have no needs, no wants, no anything of ourselves. The other thing I'm going to do while Tim is pulling this up is to shout out to somebody very special in the audience to me. Her name is Benida, and 10 years ago this year, she hired me to do my first sexual violence prevention work at UConn. So thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you.
Yes. And while folks are thinking of questions, I am just going to drop our website for the ACE and AIR Alliance of Central Ohio. I know most folks here probably aren't in Central Ohio, but we are largely doing virtual things. And there's a long history of the ACE community existing and thriving in virtual spaces. And so we are carrying that legacy on. But we also do have a number of different asynchronous resources, asynchronous learning resources on our website too. So everything ranging from like ACE 101 to how to support ACE youth in school settings. And we also have tons of resources focused on aromanticism and how to support aromantic folks. And so that is a whole other demographic that we didn't talk about today in terms of the content of the presentation. So please certainly feel free to check those resources out. All of it is 100% free. And available to folks for download, so certainly feel free to use that.
Thank you all. So not to put pressure on anybody, but anyone want to you can unmute. You're welcome to unmute or to drop something in the chat. If you have questions, even if it isn't
Private
necessarily.
message, yeah, private message us. We won't attach your name to it if you don't want to. Oftentimes folks are curious about the difference. I mentioned it very briefly, but the difference between asexual identities and words like abstinence or celibacy. I don't know, that might be helpful just to like break the ice a little bit, but asexual is obviously an identity category. Abstinence is specifically a choice not to engage in sex, so emphasis on the choice, usually potentially for a moral and or health related reason or a variety of other reasons. And celibacy is, again, choice to not engage in sex, specifically and pretty much almost exclusively with that word, just by definition, for religious and or moral reasons. So again, 3 very different words, and two that are not identities specifically. Oh, we do have a private question. Do you know of any research that focuses on sexual violence / intimate partner violence experiences of aromantic folks and how that compares with the data that you shared earlier? No, I don't have that data, and I wish I did. So even within ACE and Arrow spaces, like I like to say like the ACE and Arrow communities like kind of caucus together, but the data on aromantic folks is much less prevalent. And not that we're swimming in ACE data. I mean, we've got a lot thanks to the ACE community survey. That is the reason. And if folks who were paying attention to the chat earlier, I responded to someone that mentioned like the need for data and the fact that we don't have data that we can really look at longitudinally. And that is definitely really, really important. And the reason that we have so much ACE data is because the ACE community specifically calls for volunteers to put this survey together every year to analyze it, to make sure that it happens. And they certainly rely on other organizations to encourage folks to participate. That currently doesn't exist for the Arrow community in a significant way yet. But just given the rates at which particularly folks in the Generation Z cohort, so again, our like quote unquote traditional college age population, I would presume that we're gonna start seeing folks pushing for that data a lot more than we're seeing now. But I wish I had more data-driven resources to share, but unfortunately I don't. Ooh, it's okay. The chat is lighting up now. I wish people were taught this in elementary and high school. I didn't have sex in high school because I didn't want people want to, and people giving me a lot of crap about it. I can't imagine the pressure. I can't imagine the pressure when people give you shit about. Yes, yeah, there's a lot of that, and I think that for me at least, I don't know. I actually don't know your experience, Lynn, but for me, I was describing a textbook definition of demisexuality like all through high school and through undergrad. And it wasn't until I got to graduate school that my significant other like stumbled across the definition of demisexual. I didn't even know. I was like, this is what I experienced. I can't explain my attraction any differently than this. But I remember literally where I was. I was in my grad school apartment first year at UConn, getting ready to walk out the door to a seminar. And I saw that message from her and I was like, oh my gosh, this is the word. Like this 100% describes everything that I've been saying for a decade. And I will say that one thing I've noticed in the work that I do on our campus here in Ohio, but also the work I do in the community, is that particularly younger folks are getting greater access to this vocabulary than certainly I had. And I think that's a really wonderful thing. There's a lot of work to be done still there for sure. Really nice thank you to us and the conference planning committee. Yes, we appreciate them so much. There's a couple other private questions. Do you have any recommendations for advocating on behalf of the Arrow ACE community to people who might say there isn't space in the LGBTQ+ community for them?
Ooh.
Lynn, do you want to knock this one out? This one's a spicy question. I like it.
You know, I think it's really important. So this is a big, you can probably tell this is like a hot button issue for me. This is a big issue. I think it's really important for us to look historically at the ways in which different subcategories in the community, in the broader LGBTQ community, have experienced the same kind of gatekeeping and the same kind of, you're not queer enough, you're not this enough, you're not that enough. So this is something that's happened to folks who are bisexual, who are queer. You know, this is something that's happened a lot with trans folks in particular. You know, maybe trans folks who are not choosing to transition or who do not feel the need to transition. You know, in certain communities, this has kind of been the attitude towards trans women and femmes. So I think we can just kind of look at this historical you know, record and be like, oh, so the same arguments are happening over and over again.
Yeah.
The other thing too is that I think that there is some kind of like attitude that you know, oh, there's all of these ace folks who are, you know, heterosexual and cisgender who want to come in and take up space in all of these LGBTQ spaces. First off, I think that overestimates the number of people who are in the community who are cisgender and heterosexual. As we saw from the data, a large proportion of the population would consider themselves to be questioning or LGBTQ or T. So I think really you have to kind of say to yourself, is this like a straw person in the room, or is this something that's actually happening in reality? And if you look at the data, it's just not there.
Yeah, I think that's a solid point. My favorite response, I 100% agree with everything Lynn has just shared. My favorite response is, well, the LGBTQ plus community is a community of diverse sexualities, genders, and sexes. And if that is our definition of the community, asexuality is a diverse sexuality. Like, we know it is. We're the A in the community, oftentimes put in the plus, but we are very much a part of the community. And I love the fact that Lynn just like drove it home with the data. Well, it shows that you're wrong. Like, it shows that you're factually inaccurate. Someone did ask, and I realized we were at the 5:30 mark, so I'm gonna keep it real short. Someone asked, how do you feel about the ACE book by Angela Chin as a source of information for allosexual folks? This is the book. I would definitely recommend it. It is fantastic, and Angela Chin has done like a lot of amazing work. There are lots of podcasts, I think, that have featured her, and some articles and reviews. Yeah, really fantastic book. Would definitely recommend it. There's also some good YA books that are out for folks that are working with ACE youth, particularly high schoolers and middle schoolers. But in terms of other resources, definitely take a look at our website. We've tried to compile a whole host of things and to link to other national and international resources too. But yeah, so certainly, there's lots out there. And there's another private message that sad that asexual folks are missing something, not feeling. My first thought is, I am sad that asexual folks are missing something, not feeling sexual attraction. Do people often feel sorry for you? I don't know. I don't feel sorry, because the thing is, again, there's not a monolithic experience within the ACE community. And again, there is a very substantial portion of the ACE community that reports they have had consensual sex for a variety of reasons. And you know, that is just one aspect of potential relationship dynamics, kind of like as Lynn shared. There are like ACE folks who are very engaged in like kink communities. There are plenty of ACE folks, like I'm currently married. There are plenty of ACE folks who are in longstanding relationships with significant others who aren't necessarily ACE. And so, you know, I think like, I don't know what the rest of the sort of allosexual, so non-ACE community thinks, but I certainly don't feel like I'm missing something in my life. I love that I'm part of the ACE community. Yeah, like it's cool.
Do we have time for me to jump on really, really quick? Okay, thank you. So I think a lot of people would respond to that with saying, you know, can you miss something you never had? So that's one thing. Yes, there's a lot, but at the same time, is this, if people do feel bad or have feelings of loss or like somehow the fear of missing out, FOMO, right? is that coming from an internal place, or is that coming from the fact that we live in a society where sex is equated with love, where romantic and or sexual relationships are seen as supposedly the most important relationship in your life, that they're supposed to take precedence over, friendships and other things. And so I think that as we continue to do the work of unpacking these sort of institutions and what does it really mean for us, and what does it mean to come away from all of these maybe traditional understandings of how we're supposed to live our lives, that will create more spaces, not just for ace people, in much the way that exploring sexuality and gender creates a richer and more nuanced understanding for cisgender and heterosexual folks too. Like, it's going to make it better for everyone. The other thing too is that there are just because somebody does not experience sexual attraction doesn't mean that they don't engage in sex for other kinds of reasons, whether that's maybe to procreate, to have kids, or because sex is a stimulating experience for many people. So I don't want to make it too long, but I just want to reiterate thanking everyone, especially our wonderful organizers, for letting us go a couple minutes over.
And if I could steal one more minute, Elizabeth, then I promise.
Elizabeth's like, we're never going to just shut this down. We're good here. We're going to be here all night.
There's also a lot of analogies and some really funny, clever jokes in the ACE community around cake. So some of the analogies that folks in the ACE community will sometimes use to explain asexuality, because oftentimes that myth does pop up of, well, how do you not, don't you feel like you're missing something? Like, why everyone likes sex? Like, how do you not like sex? So one funny thing that folks sometimes use to explain it is like cake. Who doesn't like cake? Everyone likes cake. But the reality is some people don't, and that's okay. Not everyone has to like cake. But it's sort of in the history of like AVEN, that organization I talked about with the web forums in the early 2000s, but there was a thread of essentially folks who were posting things that were, quote, better than sex, and cake became a very predominant one where folks said, you know what, actually I'd rather have cake than I'd rather have sex. And so a lot of times in ACE imagery you'll see a lot of like nods to cake, and I just felt like I should probably clarify that if you end up looking up stuff on your own time afterwards, and like, why are they so obsessed as a community with cake? But that's it's a little funny sort of history there.
Yeah. Fun fact, I hate cake.
How do you not like cake?
Timothy, Lynn, thank you so much for this really enlightening experience. We will have to have you back, hopefully, when we are live.
That would be amazing.
Conversation that folks were, eager to participate in and learn from and listen. Thank you to all of the folks who have participated throughout the week. Thank you to all of you who are here right now for sticking it out. We know, folks don't stay past 5 o'clock on a holiday weekend, unless, a long weekend, unless there's some really good content in front of them or they're really committed to the work. So that's all of you. And we're just so grateful to everyone. And we hope that you have the very best weekend. And we hope to see you when we are live again in 2022, which at this point sounds weird, but Spectrum 2022 in Albany, New York, in person, fingers crossed. Thank you all so much. And with that, we are going to end Spectrum. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all so much for sticking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you also to Elizabeth for giving us a little extra time. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
Got it. Bye, y'all. We'll keep in touch. Bye.
Bye.